Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Frosthaven series. I am Nick Henning, Phoenix Gaming. We are here today to talk about the Drifter, which is a really neat starting class in Frosthaven. I think this class is both fun for experienced folks and accessible for folks who maybe don't have quite the depth of experience that other Haven players might have. And so I think the Drifter is a class that should be in a lot of parties, has a lot of flexibility, although I think kind of a couple probably primary roles, I will argue, I think, throughout this. And when we played through the beginning of Frosthaven, my partner in two-player game played Drifter, so I got to see a lot of Drifter in action. I personally have not played it myself, but still have strong feelings about how it goes. So we're going to go ahead and dive into that today. Our goal with today is to try to make this a little bit snappier than our last guide. So we're going to see how that goes for us. All right, so let's talk about the Drifter himself. Drifter is a 12-card class, which generally denotes a class with a bunch of lost cards. Drifter is, of course, no exception to that. We're going to get into that really soon. And the way that the Drifter works is sort of has these persistent cards with these trackers that you'll use, these little club trackers that will tick off essentially every time you're using them until that card goes away. So it's not a one-off use on these lost cards. You're using these lost cards sort of repeatedly. And then you'll notice kind of amusingly on the back, so they rate this as a pretty low complexity, no elemental use. I was going to say Spirit because I played a lot of Spirit Island, but Mercenary, and pretty high ratings pretty much across the board. And that, I think, speaks to the fact that the Drifter is sort of a jack of all trades, really can kind of slot in on almost any situation. With the exception of control, the Drifter is not very good at applying sort of status effects to enemies. This is a pretty, rough and tumble. I put up shields, I hit enemies, it follows the kind of basic number rules of the Haven games, more so than kind of the special tricksy effects. So that's kind of the Drifter as a whole. What we're going to dive into right now is actually talking about how do you evaluate these lost cards for the Drifter. That's not a Drifter card, you might say. That's right. The card on the right here, Icebound Quills, is a lost card. The top of it is a lost card that is employed by the Geminate, the more complex of the starting classes. And if you're doing this correctly as the Geminate, you're making a 6 attack with 2 pierce, and you get 2 experience points for this lost card that lets you go pretty quickly. So a lot going on there, right? Generally, a lost card is going to be a big wall up. This is not the most powerful of lost cards that I've seen. There's definitely other stuff that does kind of neater or weirder things, but it's a really great comparison point for us because we could consider this to be sort of a 6, or if you're fighting something with shields, maybe up to 8 points of damage in this lost card. Whereas Crushing Weight over here says on your next 6 melee attacks, you're going to add 2 to that attack. So as long as you make 6 melee attacks after playing this card, you could consider this card to be a 12 damage attack. It's just going to be kind of strung out over all of your cards here. And frankly, the Drifter's lost cards are some of the absolute best in all of the Haven games because of the insane amount of value that you generate from them. They balance this out in the Drifter by making the rest of the Drifter's cards kind of crappy and then saying, look, I'm acknowledging that you are running this class with these sort of persistent bonuses that you are playing in there. So be aware that the way that this class is balanced, if you look card for card from the Drifter comparing to other people, they're going to look pretty disappointing. But the idea is that you play these lost cards, and you have a lot of cards. You got those 12 cards that's going to push you to a level that's a little bit higher than I think actually quite a lot of Bruiser classes. Okay, geez. Yeah, out of 6 of our 15 starting cards, we have these sort of persistent abilities that will give you 6 triggers of this ability throughout. And so if you kind of use that same math that I'm suggesting, we could quickly kind of evaluate all of these cards and just really how insanely powerful they are. We talked about Crushing Weight, which I think is sort of the go-to ability. It generates plus 12 to your attacks throughout the course of the rest of the battle, assuming that you do 6 more attacks after playing this card. To its left is the other kind of aggressive one. This is adding 1 to your range attacks and 1 to their damage, so plus 6 damage and a little bit more flexibility on where your range attacks go. And then over here we have kind of our other aggressive one, except for this is Retaliate, so it's our passive aggressive one, which is 12 points of damage and retaliate to enemies within 2 spaces, which is a nice flexibility because it does end up affecting archers, which we don't always get to have with our retaliates. Along the bottom, we have sort of our more utility or defensive ones. We've got 6 sources of shield, which pairs really nicely with the retaliate, obviously. So that's 6 preemptive healing. You can kind of view it that way. On all the way on the left here, we've got the next 6 heals at +2. So 12 additional healing that you can generate. I will say this bottom left ability, I think, is the hardest to use 6 times in a scenario because it's unlikely that you're going to play tons and tons of healing cards. So of the group of these, I do think this is the hardest one to ensure you're going to get maximum usage out of. And then frankly, if these ones on the right, the shield and the retaliate, you don't get maximum usage out of, things are probably going pretty well anyway. The bottom middle one here is an additional 12 points of movement. You'll notice that in the class, rated mobility is one of the kind of lower abilities on the drifter, and actually this 12 additional movement really comes in handy as you're playing throughout the scenario. So these are sort of the 6 different main cards that you have going on there, and we'll talk about those a little bit more specifically as we go through card by card. And even more cards, a full 9 of these cards say on them you can move the character token on your persistent abilities back. So you're not really triggering your persistent abilities 6 times. You might be doing them 7 or 8 times, depending on how you are moving your abilities back and managing that throughout the round. I am going to treat these, as I'm talking through these cards, like they have their own effect. So when I play this card, Bloodletting, for instance, the perk of killing an enemy here and moving one of my abilities back means that this is in attack 3, and then depending what Voltron modes I have in play, it is either going to be an additional +2, move later on, or an additional +2 attack later on. They have more flexibility depending on what Voltron modes I have selected for that scenario. I will still treat those other cards like they have 6 triggers, but it is worth noting that you can persist those triggers by using these 9 cards to keep moving back character tokens on those persistent abilities. It's also worth noting that 6 of these 9 cards are the same cards that we talked about for actually generating those persistent effects anyway. So there's a lot of overlap in terms of sort of maintaining and then using these kinds of abilities. All right, that was a lot. Now we get to kind of slow down and just look card by card. I'm going to start off by talking about a kind of weird one. The bottom ability of this card is the one that gives you kind of persistent retaliates. My partner and I played in such a way that she was rocking a tank almost all the time, and the bottom of this card got triggered a lot of times, generating a lot of damage that cuts through shields and everything like that. This card allows you to affect certain enemies that you might have a pretty hard time engaging with otherwise. For instance, flame elementals or fire demons or whatever they're called. Really easy enemies to engage with when you have retaliate at range, because these sort of ranged enemies that might be backing up from you are going to eat this retaliate anyway, thanks to this bottom ability. That range 2 on this really pushes the bottom of this card to something I think truly special. I think this is a pretty impactful card, and what's nice about it is that you are putting something pretty offensive on the bottom of a card's ability. I'm going to talk later about how I really like the movement card, but there are some flaws with it. The fact that this actually bottom means that you're not moving can be perfect depending on the situations that you're in. If you're already engaged kind of in combat in the right spot, or if you're kind of starting off the first round by just throwing down 2 of these persistent abilities, it's pretty neat. Top of this card, I don't tend to like as much. It can be really good when you're transitioning from, you've cleared out a room and you're maybe going around looting, or your allies are long resting because you're a 12 card class and your allies might be 10 card classes or something like that. That top ability there can kind of be a nice resource management thing. I think it's really satisfying for the Eurogame players, such as myself, to use that top ability, but it doesn't have a whole lot of impact in the board. So I would really view that top ability more as like a healing ability than anything else. All right, Crushing Weight, I think, is an absolute superstar in this deck. It does a ton of damage. If you play this pretty early on, are going to attack 6 more times in melee. I think this card is an absolute unit and probably should go into just about every Drifter deck. Even if you are playing a mode of this character where you want to be a little bit more supportive, you want to be maybe more of the ranged drifter, the bottom ability on this card is completely respectable. Throwing a couple points of healing to you or an ally within range. You've got the flexibility to do either of those things. That's the number one thing about this class is flexibility. And sliding a persistent ability backwards one slot. There's just a lot of value that's generated on this card. I think this card is the absolute nuts. You should be taking it with you pretty much every single scenario. Precision aim is weirder. Like I said, we don't have a lot of experience with playing with the ranged version of the Drifter, and I'll point out later why, because I don't love generally the Drifter's ranged attacks all that much. It is nice to have a different mode from melee. It is nice that you could be playing in a party and, maybe you started off with a more balanced party, and then as folks kind of retire and put in new characters, maybe you suddenly have just a really busy front line. The fact that you can switch into doing a ranged kind of character, or there are a couple scenarios where enemies are maybe kind of behind obstacles or things like that, and having this additional flexibility there is nice. But I don't tend to think that this card is as good as putting crushing weight into play and just kind of leaning on that. And because you can kind of manage by pushing your tokens backwards, I think putting both precision aim and crushing weight into play, going both melee and range, is probably a little bit of overkill, a little bit unnecessary. So I'm not convinced that that is a valuable way to spend your time. That being said, the bottom of this ability is respectable. A move one of your persistent abilities back. It's not a far move, but it just kind of slides you around if you're doing melee combat, and a little bit of additional value there is always something that we like about this character. There's a lot of little edges that you acquire over time. I haven't commented on this, but you'll notice that the past couple cards that I've played are low initiative. The Drifter is an amazing class, I think very powerful, but it sucks at initiative. This class just trundles along. It's something that you need to be aware of, that most of your allies are going to be going better than you. I will say one of the advantages of playing with the Bone Shaper, who's another very slow class, is that we are kind of synced up very much in terms of what our strategies are going to be there. Unbreakable is a nice best friend for Relentless, which is the Retaliate one, and Crushing Weight, which is the melee one. You're going to be up in the mix a lot, so having some additional shields that you can kind of throw on your bottom here can be pretty advantageous. Having 6 additional like preemptive health that you can play from the beginning of the scenario is pretty nice. It is worth a lost card. It's a pile of experience that you get along the way. You are going to get hit 6 times, so this card is going to generate its value throughout the course of the scenario. Anyway, I've already talked about the top ability of this kind, the moving 2 tokens back. So you have my sense of that. I think this card is well worth it. I do think that this card is maybe cuttable later on, depending on kind of what your strategy, what your approach is. But, I say that and now I'm like, but what do I really want to cut it for? You have so many cards because you have 12 cards, options that you can bring with you. There's a good chance you're going to be taking this with you for a while. Even if you're rocking the ranged build, because you are a class that has the heavy hit points, you've got the fighter hit points, right, 10 at first level, you should be taking some hits. And the ability to kind of flex and take a few extra hits, even if you're kind of in ranged mode, is valuable. It's just important to recognize that this is a lost card. And, I haven't mentioned this with the others, but let's comment on the fact that we've got 6 of these, we put all 6 in a play. We're only really left with a 6-card hand. So we should be cognizant of that. Let's talk about the bottom here first. The next 6 move abilities add +2. For some scenarios, this is absolutely crucial. The Drifter is not good at moving, and you can look at the layout of the map at the beginning, and pretty quickly after playing this character 2 or 3 times, you say, I am going to need to cover some extra ground here to make sure that I am getting to where I need to go throughout the course of this scenario. In that case, the bottom of this card is just absolutely invaluable. The other thing that I like about Sustained Momentum is that this is a card that you might actually not put up in the first room, unlike a lot of the other sustain abilities. You'll kind of put them up and then you'll be shooting people and pushing the tokens back. This is a card that actually is extremely respectable to put up in the middle of a scenario. That might be because you're basically moving every turn in this game. And the first room might be something where the enemies are right there. You're going to engage with them very quickly. And then by the end of the first room, maybe you've done kind of like a reshuffle of your deck, and you go into the second room, or before you go into the second room, you put this card into play to get that additional mobility that you need. And so that means that on your first playthrough of your cards, you might use the top of this ability. And an attack 2, move a persistent ability back is fine, but if you've put crushing weight into play, and this is an attack 4, move the persistent ability back, then this basically reads attack 4, right? Because you can just push the ability back on the +2 that you just used from the crushing weight. And just a base attack 4 is a completely respectable card all on its own. So a respectable top paired with a sometimes invaluable bottom, I think is really valuable. You also find that in Frosthaven, there are a couple scenarios where you don't need to move that much. If that's the case, cut this card. All right, continuous health is my least favorite of the cards, as I mentioned before. That's because I just don't think that there are going to be 6 times that you're guaranteed to be doing that healing. And also sometimes you end up overhealing, like you want to heal someone for a little bit, or maybe they have a poison token on them, so really they're only going to be taking 1 healing anyway. There's just enough instances where this additional healing ends up being kind of a dud instead of a value. That also might be because my partner and I played this when we were lower levels. When you're higher levels and you got bigger blocks of hit points, that +2 healing might come into play more often. So maybe at higher levels, this becomes a more valuable card. And I could see shifting out maybe that shield 1 in the bottom 6 abilities for this if you have the healing cards to play in there. Or frankly, if your party has no support whatsoever and you want to play that role in a given encounter, this card can do the work here. But of these 6 cards that we talked about, this one is kind of, I think, the one that ended up being the least commonly used, the least useful, the one that is least likely to get you your full 3 experience points or maybe more. That being said, on the other hand, the top of it is one of the best ones, right? The fact that you've got a ranged ability that does this attack and push a slot backwards does make this one of the more flexible top abilities of these different classes. So I think that there's kind of an implication here that the healing and the ranged build sort of go together. This sort of combo of precision aim and continuous health is maybe a little bit of a more friendly with each other sort of mode than the kind of other crushing weight mode, which really benefits actually from all 3 of its friends. You want to have some additional move if you are, let me get my face on screen here. You want to have that additional move if you are getting into melee a whole bunch. You want to have those shields. You want to have those retaliates. So I think sort of the top 2 here pair most nicely, and the bottom 4 here pair most nicely with each other. Now, let's just briefly talk about the fact that, like I mentioned, if you use all 6 of these cards, you have just put too many things into play. And there were plenty of scenarios where my partner went for the full 4 trifecta, right? The crushing weight, the retaliate, the shield, the move, which makes you into just a giant behemoth, but it also turns you into an 8-card class, and you had to spend 4 of your actions probably earlier in the scenario kind of getting these things up. Now, that being said, 3 of those are bottom abilities, so if you're already engaged in melee from the beginning, that's pretty sweet. I think one of the hardest things about this class is that in order to get your damage output up there, you really need to start the first round by putting precision aim or crushing weight into play. And unfortunately, that means on turn 1, you're kind of one of the most paltry classes. But what's nice about these other kind of persistent cards is that they're all bottoms. And so once you sort of put your starting sort of what my violence type is going to be in this scenario into play, and you are in position already, you can then use those bottom abilities to decide how you're going to run the rest of the scenario while using your tops to actually do some damage. So this class is one that sort of takes a round to get going, but really it is only a round. And I think folks maybe would make the mistake of thinking that the Drifter takes longer to get set up and get going. I think really it only takes the 1 turn to do that. All right, so those were our 6 of our 15 possible starting cards, right? The 1 and the X's. And what we're going to talk about next are the melee cards, the support cards, and the ranged cards. There's roughly kind of 3 of each of them, although you can kind of read each card a little bit differently. And I think that's kind of a good way to look at it, is there's a good chance you're going to take 5-ish, maybe all 6 of the cards that I just showed you into a scenario, and then you might take 3 melee and 3 support cards, or 3 melee and 3 ranged cards, or 3 ranged and 3 support cards. And that can be a way that you can kind of set up your build, kind of knowing what you're going to do as you're heading into the scenario. You might do a little bit of a different, only take 4 of the persistent cards, right? Because those are the ones that you're going to put into play, and then take some combination of 8 of these 9 cards that I'm about to show you. But that's the kind of thing that I think you're thinking about in advance. And unlike a lot of other classes, you can, and I think should, if you're maximizing this class, decide what mode you're going to from scenario to scenario based on A, your party composition in that moment, which might change, and B, what the scenario is demanding of you. I think the most important question you can ask yourself when you move into that scenario is, how much movement am I going to need here? Because that's going to impact when I need to put that move card into play, or if I even need to bring it with me. Since I like melee build best, we're going to start with melee cards. Violent Inheritance here is a totally fine, mediocre workhorse card at the top that does an attack and some loot. This has come up. This came up in my last video with Bone Shaper, where I was dunking on the Bone Shaper's loot card. My partner and I just don't value the loot action very much. We trundle on to loot tiles as much as we can. I like collecting loot a lot more than my partner does. But we tend to pick it up as it goes. And in a 2-player game, you tend to have less gluts of enemy loot together. So loot actions only wind up picking you up, usually about 2 treasure along the way anyway. So I'm going to continue dunking on loot cards. I don't think this card's that great. It doesn't really do a whole lot for me. And while the bottom loss here is totally respectable, a pretty good move, which you sometimes really need because this class sucks at moving, with a ranged attack on it is nice and actually is really great for breaching doors. So primarily, I think this bottom ability is great for moving into the final room of a scenario. But that scenario probably has been going well for you already, because you are a 12 card class, but you've probably used 2, 3, or even 4 if you're feeling greedy of your persistent abilities. And if you're getting near the end of the scenario, losing another card really might become a problem for you. So if you're in good shape, this bottom feels really good. But if you're in bad shape, then losing a card kind of isn't great anyway. So I don't love Violent Inheritance. It's okay. Your mileage may vary. Let me know if you find something better about it in the comments. I do want to really put some respect on how good this bottom ability is at breaching rooms, though. The ability to go in, do an attack, and then have a top action with that is pretty incredible. So I do want to respect this card for that reason. I just don't like the idea of putting more losses into a deck that already has a fair amount of losses going for it. All right, this is your other kind of like weird hyper melee card. This card is strange. I mean, first of all, it's one of your lowest initiative cards, so it needs some respect for that alone. But both the top and the bottom are loss abilities, and they attack a pile of enemies at once. I suspect this card is a whole lot better in a 4-player game than it is in a 2-player game, because your enemies are more likely to pile up in such a way that you're going to get value out of attacking all of them. I just talked about how much I don't like losing cards on this class, though, because you already lose a number of cards, even though you start with 12 of them. But if you can set up a situation where you're attacking 3, 4, 5 enemies, go for it. I mean, that's amazing. That's very well worth it, especially in attack 5s becomes really, really nasty along the way here. And this bottom ability, like as an attack there, that's range 2, that is a really strong bottom attack ability. I think that it is respectable if you think this card is going to come in handy later in the scenario, to take it and just use it for its base move 2s and its base melee 2s along the way. This is the best class at using cards for their default base 2 abilities. So if you like the idea of possibly hitting someone with this big wombo combo, this is the class to do it with. They are the only ones that can get away with it, because you can turn those move 2s into move 4s, those attack 2s into melee 4s. And I actually can't even remember if I know Gloomhaven has cards that improve base abilities. I'm not sure that Frosthaven does. I haven't played with them, if we have, or we haven't found them, one or the other. Would you believe that I went through the entire rest of this guide without recording, and accidentally paused when I was not supposed to pause and unpaused when I wasn't supposed to pause? So that's why it's darker and my face is a little bit more illuminated right now. You'll just have to bear with me. Bloodletting is the last of the melee cards at level 1, and it is the best of them by a fair margin. First of all, I love this bottom ability. If you've watched my other videos, you know how much I value Wound really highly. I like it more than most people, perhaps at an unhealthy level. But this bottom ability can be an attack 3 with a Wound, which is a bottom ability. It's just very, very nice. And the top ability can be a big hit that immediately refunds your token that slides over. So I think Bloodletting is a pretty nice melee card, does a lot of work for this class. Let's move into the ranged cards, although actually we're going to start off with a card that is a hybrid. Fortitude can be a ranged card or it can be a melee card. There are times when you just need something to be 2 spaces away so you don't have to move, or you can keep your bottom ability there, and this can slot into a melee build, a ranged build. Fortitude is a card that you will take with you if enemies have shields, and you won't take with you if your enemies don't have shields in most instances. I think the bottom ability on this card is not very good. It is hard to control when you kill an enemy. I think 2-player parties only have so many monsters, and in a 4-player party, there's just so much chaos that you can't kind of count on how many folks you're gonna end up slaying throughout the course of the scenario. I just think that the lost card for this is not necessarily worth the amount of pushbacks that it gives you. I think there are other cards that do this kind of thing, but a little bit better, and doesn't cost you, one of the card slots for losing cards that you can do. So I'm not a big fan of the bottom. I think this card basically fills its role if you need something to pierce. Draining Arrows is the payoff card, I think, for the ranged build. Being able to very quickly fire off +1 damages at 3 range and muddling people can do a fair amount. I don't know that makes a range build viable, in my opinion. I don't think this is a very exciting card in its base. It's nice to muddle a handful of people, but a range 2-3 target is unlikely. As base of the ability top here is not great. That being said, you'll probably take this card with you into every scenario for a while, because 23 is one of your more respectable initiative numbers, and a move 3 is one of your more respectable moves. Further, the bottom ability is very easy to manipulate, very easy to get a move backwards on your token. So the bottom of this card and initiative alone are well worth it, ignoring sort of the top part of the ranged. Deadly Shot is exactly the same story. A respectable initiative. That bottom move 4 is the only move 4 that you have without essentially playing your upgraded move card at the beginning of the scenario. So you need it. You need it just for that reason alone, and bumping it up to a move 6 doesn't hurt either. I do think that the top ranged attack is a nice little role player. Pinging someone and putting some poison on them can be really advantageous. It was especially advantageous with the Bone Shaper because, I've got extra minions that can take advantage of that poison, and they hit for little weenie shots anyway. So we do like that, but you're just going to be playing the bottom part of this card so often that the ranged part of it ends up not mattering so much. We're moving into kind of the more support cards at this stage, and No Remorse is an interesting card in that I think on paper this card's not that great. Heal 3 as a top ability is like, okay, I mean, it'll come into handy here and there, and then the bottom of this card can make you move a huge amount of distance. If you're set up for it, this can make you move 9 spaces, which is a lot, and do an attack. The 20 initiative is very nice. I think the one thing that I kind of most like about this card is for the times when you have finished clearing a room, you long rest, your allies are maybe not already on the long rest cycle, you're just kind of off cycle with each other, and you have one of those turns where you want to set up before you go into the door of the next room. You can heal yourself or heal an ally for a little bit extra of what they need, and then also sort of this is maybe the ideal time before you're finishing the first room to put sustained momentum into play to get those extra moves that get you kind of really pushed past that breach into the second room there. So it fills a nice timing role in some ways. And if your party doesn't really have any heals, or if you're playing the support role, you're going to play the card. But otherwise, I don't think that it is necessarily the most exciting card. Brooded Preparation, I think, is one of the most complex cards for the Drifter, because on paper, this isn't a card that I normally like all that much. I don't really like the Bruiser classes that have these like shield ones, retaliate ones. They just don't feel worth it compared towards like making an attack. usually the best kind of defense in those two best defenses in the Haven games. One is killing the enemy flat out, and two is moving away from the enemy. This doesn't do either of those things, and so I don't tend to love these kinds of things. But if you stack this up with your other retaliates and your other shields, you can suddenly have a lot of shield and a lot of retaliate. And if you have a bunch of enemies that are attacking at a small amount of damage, you can kind of really end up punishing them. So I saw my partner actually put this card to pretty nasty use. The bottom ability is also like fine and respectable. A little like pinging heal at some range allows you to like throw poisons and wounds off of people, or just kind of give a little bit of bolstering extra health. The other thing is that this card also just has its base melee 2 and its base move 2. And you're like, well, of course, all cards have that. But the reason that I need to mention that with Prudent Preparation is that it is a 14 initiative and it is your best initiative card, I think maybe across all of your cards. I think there is actually no level where you get a card that is better than initiative 14. So this is the fastest you are ever going to go. Yeah, I'm correct with that. And so for that reason, this card is worth it because it's got 4 different okay modes that let you go first, or at least let you go near enough to first, depending on the enemies that you're fighting. So Prudent Preparation, I think, is well worth it. And then finally, we've got Vile Assault. I think Vile Assault is a great card. The top of this card can do a lot of damage if you've got Crushing Weight and still got space on it. This is an attack 4 poison followed by an attack 4, which the enemy has poison, so really kind of an attack 5, and wound, which is like another point of damage. So this is like 10 points of damage that you can do if you have Crushing Weight set up for it, which is a brutal finisher. And the bottom of this card does what you wanted to do. You trundle a little bit and heal yourself, which is nice if you're in melee mode. It's just nice if it's incidental for really any class. Moving 2 is not that great, but both of these things are supported by your various other persistent abilities. And so I think Vile Assault is a great card you're going to take with you into just about any scenario along the way. All right, let's dive into talking about some of the higher level cards as we move up in levels. All right, my partner took Shockwave, which I really agree with. The top ability is a little weird and came into play less than I think maybe anticipated, because you need enemies to be adjacent to each other. It's niche. It needs kind of a specific setup, but it does at least cut through shields and things like that, which is nice. But really, you're taking this card for its 17 initiative and its move 3 shield 1, which is a really nice ability to have on a tanky class. Shockwave, I think, is just for the bottom of this card. You can take some scissors and snip off that top half of that card. Is worth it entirely in and of its own. Ever Forward is a mediocre ranged attack that also lets you put Rejuvenate on yourself, which is a little funky because you gotta make sure you don't get hit between now and the next round. The bottom ability there, if you have absolutely no support or healing in your party, is a nice way to just plink off a bunch of poisons or wounds from your fellow players. I just don't think Ever Forward is comparable to Shockwave unless you're really not committed to doing melee ever. To me, level 3 is a little weird and not terribly exciting as a level up option. Dual Bow here is a fine enough attack, I guess. 2 for 2 targets is not the most exciting thing. You expect to see that at first level for some characters and don't bring it into scenarios with you. The bottom of this card, however, I've been thinking about for a while. And I'm actually quite coming around to it, because if you've got 2 cards in play that you're going to use a lot of, this is 2/3, right? 4 slots, 2/3 of those cards. And if you like those 2 cards, it's 4/3 of a card, right? 2 times 2/3, 4/3. So in essence, this can take your base persist abilities and be a little bit more than that. So I actually kind of like the bottom of Dual Bow. That being said, my partner ended up taking Fierce Barrage here for the top ability alone. Just having the ability to attack 2 enemies for 4 damage seemed interesting enough to her, and it worked out just fine. Sometimes it was useful, sometimes it wasn't. I think the bottom of this ability is really weird. You don't have that many ranged attack abilities anyway, and the ones that you do have tend to have multi-targets already. And so I really don't love the bottom of this card. I don't think that First Barrage is worth it. 3rd level, I think, is not the most exciting of the levels. But I think I maybe have talked myself into trying out Dual Bow if I end up playing Drifter. On the other hand, level 4 is pretty cool. We do like level 4. So Chunk of Flesh is the card that my partner ended up taking, and it does a lot of work. Just the top of that card does all the little role player things that you want. Some melee, some healing, Moving your persistent abilities is great. And then the bottom there is just a strict upgrade from one of your original cards that gives you shield 1, which is, I think, maybe a little bit okay. It depends on the scenario. But shield 2 6 times is suddenly very, very good. I would say twice as good. Chunk of Flesh is well worth it. I think top and bottom, and you can play the top ability and then put the bottom into play kind of later in the scenario depending on how things are going. Really great card. Gift of Prey has a fine role player attack on the top and a good move on the bottom. This is just like a totally decent, solid card made better by the fact that you are the Drifter, and the ability to get your tokens back. So if you're going kind of the more ranged build, you might take this card. If you just don't like putting shields into play, maybe you'll take it as the melee build for the move, or trying to avoid putting that move card into play, the unstable momentum. But I think Chunk of Flesh just strikes me as the better card of these two. Level 5 is really cool for the Drifter. I'm going to talk about Breakthrough, which is the card that my partner ended up choosing. Breakthrough is just great. It's on the right enemies and attack 8, right? Because it's 4 + 2 for crushing weight, +2 for the pierce. And you get to maybe use another resource to throw a wound on. Does a lot of work there. And the bottom is a move 4, which is a thing that we really value and we like to have, and a pretty easy way to move one of our slots backwards. Breakthrough is just a great card and the one that I think you probably should take. That being said, Survivalist is awful fun and wiki-wacky. The next 6 heals give Ward, and Ward takes half damage from enemies, and against the right enemies, that can be a lot of additional preventative damage. The bottom of this card is also pretty cool. I don't normally like loot that much, but if it's move 2 and then loot, you can pretty much guarantee you're going to pick up 2 treasures, maybe even 3, and put a lot of healing on yourself. Obviously, it's a pretty garbage initiative. I would still take Breakthrough in this instance, but I could definitely see building towards Survivalist. It's pretty interesting. Level 6 is wild. This, I think, is the stage where we ended up retiring, so we're moving into totally uncharted territory for me. Consume Stamina is a wacky card, and if you have gone for the ranged build and ignored my advice about going for the melee build, this is your payoff card, because the ability to do an attack 3, range 5, 2 targets, if you've done all the things, and then take those attacks and turn them into healing, because it does specifically say suffered by targets of the attack ability, then that is big. That's basically a lost card ability, but in a repeatable card. And if you had some stamina-based way of returning this card to your hand, it could do even more work. I think Consume Stamina is literally a build-around card. Really interesting, really exciting. The bottom here is weird to me. I mean, it's good on the melee build, I suppose. 21 is a little bit slower than you want to put a Retaliate up, but it's okay. But the top is the ranged ability and the bottom is the melee ability. I find it a little funky. Even in the melee builds, I think I take Consume Stamina because the bottom is solid enough and a way to kind of slide your tokens back, because enemies just need to be near you when they're dying. It doesn't even need to die from your Retaliate, which is nice to point out. And maybe in some instances you want to do a Consume Stamina, even at a lower amount, like attack 2, heal 2 is like okay if you're kind of stuck, not in the right situation. I also just don't love accurate strikes that much. The ability to have kind of like these additional pierces here, like we have already some ways to put pierces into play. Not a ton, but a couple. And it's going to be good in some scenarios and totally useless in other scenarios. So that means that in those other scenarios, you're using it for the bottom of its ability, which is nice. Gain, advantage on your attacks this round. Move 2 is like, okay. I think they probably could have rubbed a little bit more respect on this card and just straight up given you strengthen, so you get 2 rounds of advantage, but maybe they just found that was too good or something. I'm going to go with Consume Stamina at level 6. Level 7 seems like a no-brainer to me, but please tell me in the comments if I'm wrong. Unending Fight is a totally solid card that, if you look at those as +2s, is attack 4, move 5, attack 4, repeatable card. Pretty dang good. And I already talked about how I sort of was appealed to dual bow earlier. I think this is a little worse than dual bow, because having 3 abilities that you're moving back 3 slots requires a more specific setup on your part. That being said, if you've got it set up where you have like your move, your shield, or retaliate, and your melee in play, and you slide all those back. Or if you're even going kind of the ranged support build and you've got your heal and your ranged in play, and you slide 3 of those back 3 spaces, that's 9 slots, which is 1.5 cards worth of lost cards. So pretty respectable bottom ability on Unending Fight with a good initiative as well. Like the Wind is weirder and I don't like it. Please tell me why I'm wrong about that. But after you heal, you get to jump somewhere. I don't get that. There's not a lot of instances where I'm thinking like, if only I could heal and then proceed to jump immediately afterwards. But this card lets you do that. I'm sure you could find uses for it, but just not going to be persistently that helpful. The bottom of this ability is good, move around and get some pretty easy ways of moving your persistent abilities backwards a slot. I just think the card's really weird and super, super niche. I'm going to be taking on Ending Fight, I think, on any build. On the other hand, level 8 is really exciting, and I have a hard time choosing between these cards. We're going to start with Inevitable Conclusion. I respect the Tinkerer from Gloomhaven, which is commonly considered to be one of the weakest classes in the game, but I really like Net Shooter in that, and Inevitable Conclusion is just a really, really big net shooter. You get to do a big pile of damage to people that are from you, like in front of you. If you hit a lot of targets with it and immobilize them, if they're the right kind of enemies, they might end up doing nothing at all. So that's a pretty good lost card there that does a lot of work. But the bottom of this card is also deeply respectable. I love my bottom attacks. If you can kind of move into melee and then you're just pounding on enemies, which is often what you're going to be doing, this is a great way to just pile on some extra damage. Inevitable Conclusion is good on both halves, and you like to see a card with a very, very solid bottom with kind of a huge payoff as a lost card on the top. So Inevitable Conclusion is cool, but Against All Odds is also really nifty. I think this is treated as a melee attack, even though it says all enemies within 2 hexes. And so you could set up a situation where you have Crushing Weight and you attack 5 enemies at an attack 3, and then it goes down and it goes all the way back up and you get a bunch of experience and you get to like continue using the card. It's a lot of setup for it. I'm not sure that it's worth the setup for it, but it's kind of cool when it does work that way. And then the bottom ability is just unique, something different that we haven't seen from the Drifter before. This essentially setting for charge where they can move at you and then they take damage from moving next to you. By the time you're level 8, that's probably not knocking down enemies wholesale just as they come up to you. This would be much nastier, obviously, at lower levels. But still, it's unpreventable damage that is just going to come along the way there. So I think it's pretty valuable. I think I'm leaning towards Inevitable Conclusion, but I could see both these cards being pretty exciting. As with most classes, level 9 is just bonkers. We're going to start with Use Every Part, the card on the left, because it's just a very, very solid card that you're going to use over and over and over again. An attack and a heal on the top, a move and an attack on the bottom, modified by your persistent abilities. Probably just does a lot of work. An 18 initiative is about as good as it's going to get for you. So Use Every Part is just a really, really solid functional card all the time. Very, very happy to add it to the retinue. At first I didn't get Everlasting because it has 4 circles instead of 6. And then I was like, oh, of course, it's a persistent ability, which makes this card potentially insane in certain scenarios. You could just sort of nearly infinitely be immune to 4 or less damage if you managed it correctly, and that just seems wild to me. So Everlasting seems very, very cool, and the bottom of this card is actually quite good also. Being able to target multiple allies with healing and rejuvenate and strengthen, or yourself even, is a pretty sweet bottom ability. So you could use that for a few laps and then kind of throw Everlasting on yourself near the end and just kind of push through the tanking. By the time you're level 9, maybe not that many enemies are doing 4 or less damage, but damage tends to accrue kind of like in chunks. You don't tend to take 10 and 10 and 10 and then you go down. It's that you take 10 and then 3 and then 5 and then 2. And being able to mitigate those smaller amounts of damage does really kind of make you feel a little bit more everlasting. So both these cards seem pretty good. I'm not good at evaluating level 9 cards because I've almost never played level 9 characters. So you'll have to let me know if any of you have tried either of them out. They both seem deeply exciting. We are getting to the end here as we're talking about the Drifter. And we're not going to talk about items. I don't like doing the spoilers for items. I also might not have all the items in the game. So I'm not big on talking about item builds, but you can probably put 2 and 2 together. I think you're pretty intelligent in terms of how you're going to do this. But let's quickly talk about perks here. There are a lot of good ones. I'm just going to kind of go a little bit out of order to show you the ones that I think are the ones that catch my eye the most. So I always like, when I'm playing melee characters, to take these ignore item -1 effects. The fact that it comes with a +1 card as well is one of the ones that I'm going to take earliest. Other people like ignore scenario effects more than I do, but if it comes with an additional +1 card in it, I'm pretty happy to take that card. So these cards or these perks are ones that I'm probably taking on the earlier side. I really like the excitement of another kind of potential, essentially a critical in my deck. I'm going to be putting this +3 card just because I like the variance of that. This card also catches my eye, bringing an additional handed item into each scenario. It depends on your kind of resource situation, but I like the management of items, gives you a lot of flexibility with your character. So this is something that I would probably prioritize as well. And you'll notice that I kind of talked about the ones that don't end up modifying your deck that much, a bunch of them. So if you're just the kind of person that just wants to have a better attack deck, the Drifter has a ton of options for doing that, just improving your negatives to positives and so on and so forth. My partner also had a blast with this ability. Even though it actually technically weakens your attack deck, the ability to constantly be using your persistent abilities and just incidentally be pushing them back, you will always find abilities to push backwards with this card. So you're always happy to draw those +0s because they keep your persistent abilities in play, and usually about 50% of the time end up netting you another experience point for doing so. I don't love these rolling modifiers with pushes and pierces. I don't like, those kinds of abilities are ones that are niche in specific moments, and I might have planned or not planned around getting those, and so I'm not a big fan of those cards. I think this +2 pin or +2 immobilize card, I call it pin, is much better if you're doing one of the ranged builds, and it's okay if you're doing one of the normal builds. I would be choosing one of these for melee rather than this, but this is pretty neat. I always like rolling modifier heals. I think if you're playing a tanky version of this character, these are just a solid role player. It's kind of in the middle of my choice list, but I'm happy to put these in my deck. This perk I would probably never ever take. For me, double perks need to be really good and do something impressive for me to want to do them. Maybe I'm just impatient and really like to get my benefits right now. But this just doesn't do enough for me, and I don't know how often I end up long resting in a scenario. This character admittedly can long rest more than other characters just because you have 12 cards, so you can go on forever and ever and ever and ever. But the benefit for the amount of times that I'm long resting is just, I think, not worth it at all. And then this bottom one here is really funky, super unique. I don't think any other character has anything like this. I think loot is in general pretty good. To go fishing for extra random items is very nice. I probably would only take this bottom one depending on my personal retirement goal, if I'm the kind of person that likes to push towards retirement. But I think there's just other perks that I'm more excited to take along the way. And that pretty much brings us to the end here for the Drifter, which I think is just a very exciting class. It's straightforward, but it gives you a lot of flexibility. I think this is the kind of class that you feel very smart managing. It's a very validating class, and trying to run it well is satisfying. I'll also point out that both of these masteries, unlike a lot of other classes, are legitimately viable at level 1. I think they're hard to pull off. I think I've read enough stories online of people trying to go for masteries and tanking their party for it, so be wary when you give them a shot and be kind of very cognizant of when you're doing that. But they're both viable at level 1, which is not true for a lot of the classes. So that gives you an opportunity to get a couple of these extra perks along the way and improve your kind of game that way. Hope you enjoyed this video about the Drifter. We tried to keep it a little bit shorter than our last one. We'll see how we did it when we finish with the editing. But thanks for joining me today, and I'll be back with more Frosthaven content soon. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.